This can't be happening. How could they do this?
The foreclosure notice came in a plain white envelope, over just $500. After 22 years in the Army and a lifetime of service, a 62-year-old veteran was now days away from losing the home he thought he'd retire in peacefully. Not because of missed mortgage payments, not because of taxes, but because his HOA said he violated community standards. $500 in fines, late fees, administrative penalties. And when he couldn't pay immediately, they moved to take everything. Neighbors watched quietly at first, assuming there had to be more to the story. But what the HOA didn't expect was what happened when the truth started spreading down the block. How did a minor dispute turn into a foreclosure threat, and who really crossed the line? For more than a decade, David Carter lived the kind of quiet life most people picture when they think about retirement. At 62, the former Army veteran had traded early morning drills for early morning coffee on his front porch. His modest single-family home sat in a neat tree-lined subdivision governed by the Homeowners Association, the kind with trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and a polished sign at the entrance promising community excellence. David wasn't flashy. His lawn was cut every Saturday. The flag outside his home was folded properly at dusk. His driveway was clean, his trash cans stored out of sight. Neighbors described him as steady, respectful, and mostly private. He'd wave, help jumpstart a car, or carry in groceries for an older resident, but he never looked for attention. The HOA board, however, was known for its attention to detail. Over the years, small notices occasionally appeared in residents' mailboxes. Reminders about acceptable paint shades, approved fence heights, or holiday decorations staying up too long. Most homeowners grumbled, paid small fines, and moved on. It was simply part of living there. David had never been on their radar, until the day a routine inspection flagged something non-compliant. At first, it seemed minor, a technical violation, the kind of thing that could be fixed with a quick conversation, but instead of a conversation, a formal letter arrived, then another, then fees began stacking up. What started as a small correction quickly turned into something far more serious and far more personal. At first, David treated the violation, noticed the way he had handled problems his entire life, calmly and directly. The letter claimed that a non-approved exterior modification had been observed during a routine inspection. No warning, no prior conversation. Just a formal citation, stamped and dated, with a compliance deadline and a $75 administrative fee already attached. The issue, a small wooden ramp at the edge of his driveway. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't elaborate. It was functional. After years of knee injuries from his service, David had installed the low-profile ramp so he could maneuver equipment and move heavy items without straining himself. It barely changed the appearance of the driveway. Most neighbors hadn't even noticed it. But the HOA had. David responded immediately. He submitted paperwork explaining the medical necessity. He included documentation. He requested a variance. He expected at the very least a conversation. Instead, 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. The board had denied the request. The ramp, they wrote, disrupted the uniform aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. He was ordered to remove it within 10 days. Failure to comply would result in daily fines. David stared at the letter longer than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the decision, it was the tone. Cold, procedural, impersonal. As if he were a case number instead of a neighbor who had lived there for over a decade. He didn't remove the ramp. The fines began, $50 a day, then late fees when the original fine wasn't paid, then administrative charges for continued noncompliance. Within a month, the total had climbed past $500. Neighbors started to notice the tension. Some had received their own minor citations over the years, a trash bin left visible, a hedge trimmed unevenly, but nothing like this. Still, most stayed quiet. No one wanted to attract attention from the board. The HOA president, a sharply organized woman known for strict interpretations of the bylaws, insisted the rules were clear. No unapproved exterior structures. No exceptions. David attended the next board meeting. He walked in prepared, carrying copies of his documentation, photographs, and a written request for reconsideration. He expected professionalism. Instead, he was met with formal procedure and visible impatience. The board maintained that granting one exception would open the door for others. Standards had to be upheld. Property values depended on consistency. The ramp remained. So did the fines. What began as $75 had ballooned into hundreds, then over 1,000. Interest accumulated, certified letters replaced standard mail. The language shifted from violation to delinquency. Then came the warning no homeowner ever expects to read, a pre-foreclosure notice. David reread it several times to be certain. The HOA had the authority under community bylaws to place a lien on the property for unpaid assessments and fines. If unresolved, the lien could proceed toward foreclosure, all over a ramp. The absurdity of it clashed with the seriousness of the threat. He had paid his mortgage faithfully. Taxes were current. Utilities never late, yet the association governing his neighborhood now claimed the power to take his home. Word began to spread more visibly. One neighbor quietly asked him what was happening. Another admitted they'd received similar letters in the past, but paid immediately out of fear. A few began digging through their own HOA documents, realizing just how much authority the board actually held. David attempted mediation. He offered to modify the ramp, repaint it, adjust its angle, anything that would satisfy the aesthetic concern while preserving its function. Each proposal was declined. The board insisted on full removal and full payment of all accumulated fines before further discussion. The total had now surpassed $2,000. Every envelope felt heavier than the last. Then came another escalation. The HOA contracted a law firm specializing in collections. The next letter was no longer signed by the board. It was from an attorney. The amount due now included legal fees. The lien had officially been filed with the county. The situation had shifted from neighborhood dispute to legal battle. David's mailbox became a source of dread. Some neighbors began whispering more openly. Questions circulated about transparency, about whether the board had considered hardship exceptions, about why enforcement seemed selective. A few residents recalled other situations where minor violations had been overlooked, but only for certain households. The tension in the community thickened. David filed a formal dispute, challenging the fines and requesting a hearing under state law. He argued that the ramp qualified as a reasonable accommodation. The HOA responded by scheduling a compliance hearing weeks later, after additional fines would accumulate. Each delay worked against him. The amount owed crossed $3,000. Then came the certified envelope that changed everything. It wasn't just a threat of foreclosure anymore. It was a formal notice of intent to proceed if the debt remained unpaid. David stood on his porch holding that letter as neighbors watched from behind curtains and partially opened doors. The quiet subdivision, once defined by uniform lawns and trimmed hedges, now carried an undercurrent of unease. If it could happen to him over something this small, what stopped it from happening to anyone? For the first time, a few residents began questioning the board publicly. A community email thread surfaced. Someone requested financial transparency. Another demanded to know how much had been spent pursuing a $500 violation. The board responded firmly. Rules were rules. Enforcement was non-negotiable. But the story was no longer contained to private mailboxes. The day of the compliance hearing felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom without a judge. Rows of folding chairs filled the community clubhouse. Homeowners who had never attended a board session before now lined the walls, whispering in low, tense tones. The air carried something heavier than curiosity. It carried doubt. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat behind a long table stacked with binders, printed bylaws, and highlighted enforcement policies. The association's attorney occupied the seat beside them, legal pad ready, expression unreadable. David arrived early. He wasn't dressed for battle. He wore the same quiet confidence he carried through most of his life: pressed shirt, steady posture, documents neatly organized in a simple folder. But there was something different in his eyes. The months of letters, fines, and escalating threats had hardened his resolve. The hearing opened with procedure. The board outlined the violation history. Non-approved structure, continued non-compliance, unpaid fines, legal costs, lien filed. The numbers were read aloud in a flat administrative tone. Over $3,000 now owed. Foreclosure proceedings authorized if payment was not received within the designated window. Then David's case was presented as if it were nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. What the board did not expect was what came next. Instead of pleading for mercy or arguing emotionally, David submitted a formal packet to the attorney. Inside were medical records, federal disability documentation, and most importantly, a written legal opinion from a housing attorney he had consulted days earlier. The ramp, the opinion stated, qualified as a reasonable accommodation under federal housing law. Denying it without engaging in an interactive process could constitute discrimination. Pursuing foreclosure under those circumstances could expose the association and individual board members to significant liability. A quiet shift moved through the room. For months, the narrative had painted David as a rule breaker refusing to comply. Now the story was reframed. A disabled veteran requesting accommodation met with escalating punishment. The attorney flipped through the documents slowly. The board members' expressions tightened. What had felt like routine enforcement was suddenly something else entirely, something riskier. Then David did something no one expected. He distributed copies of the lien filing and fine breakdown to the audience. Homeowners leaned forward, scanning line items. Administrative charges stacked on top of late fees, legal retainers billed against a homeowner over a $500 initial dispute. Murmurs grew louder. People began calculating in their heads what similar action would cost them if they ever fell out of favor. The board attempted to regain control, reminding attendees that order must be maintained. But the damage was done. Transparency had shifted the power dynamic. One resident stood and asked how many other accommodations had been requested and denied. Another questioned why mediation offers had not been formally documented. A third asked how much association money had already been spent on legal action over a small ramp. The board hesitated. For the first time since the dispute began, they were no longer the unquestioned authority in the room. The attorney requested a brief recess. Behind closed doors, the conversation was no longer about aesthetics. It was about risk, about exposure, about whether the association's aggressive posture could now backfire into something far more expensive than a wooden ramp. When the meeting resumed, the tone had changed. The attorney announced that the board would suspend foreclosure proceedings pending further legal review. The lien would remain temporarily, but enforcement actions would be paused. Additionally, the association would enter into a formal accommodation evaluation process. It wasn't a full surrender, but it was a crack in the wall. The room exhaled collectively. For months, the HOA had projected certainty. Now they were recalculating. David didn't celebrate, he didn't smile. He simply nodded, gathered his documents, and walked out with the same steady posture he arrived with. The fight wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. Outside, neighbors approached him quietly. Some thanked him, others admitted they'd been afraid to speak up before. A few quietly shared their own stories of fines paid out of fear. The narrative had flipped. 2 days later, a community-wide email was sent by the HOA board. It announced an emergency review of enforcement procedures, a temporary freeze on certain fines, and a commitment to revising accommodation policies to ensure compliance with federal law. They didn't admit fault, they didn't apologize, but the language was unmistakable. The foreclosure action would not proceed. The association had blinked. And for the first time since that plain white envelope arrived in his mailbox, David's home was no longer under immediate threat. Yet as the dust began to settle, one question lingered over the neighborhood like a storm cloud slowly moving on. If one homeowner standing firm could force the board to retreat, how many others had simply walked away in silence? In the weeks that followed the hearing, something subtle but undeniable shifted inside the neighborhood. The foreclosure notice never returned. Instead, David received a certified letter stating that the lien would be withdrawn pending the outcome of a newly initiated reasonable accommodation review. The language was careful. Controlled, legal, but for the first time in months, the threat of losing his home was off the table. The ramp remained in place. Behind the scenes, the HOA's attorney advised the board to move cautiously. What had once seemed like a straightforward enforcement case now carried the possibility of federal scrutiny. The board quietly entered negotiations, requesting additional documentation and offering what they described as a compromise. The ramp could stay if slightly modified to match the driveway's finish and meet certain design guidelines. It was the same solution David had proposed months earlier, before thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees had piled up. This time the tone was different. The fines were rescinded, legal fees were reduced to zero. The lien filing was formally canceled with the county clerk. A short notice was posted to the community portal stating that the matter had been resolved amicably. But the residents knew better. For many homeowners, the incident became a wake-up call. The bylaws they had skimmed during closing suddenly felt more important. The authority they had assumed was balanced now seemed capable of overreach. Conversations that once happened in private moved into open forums. Questions were asked, budgets were reviewed, enforcement logs were requested. Within 3 months, 2 long-standing board members chose not to seek re-election. A small group of residents, including a retired accountant and a former paralegal, ran for open positions with a platform centered on transparency and proportional enforcement. They promised clearer communication, documented accommodation procedures, and limits on escalating fines without mediation. They won. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they happened steadily. The new board adopted written guidelines requiring direct conversation before issuing formal citations. Accommodation requests were documented with timelines and review standards. Fines could no longer accumulate daily without an internal vote. Legal escalation required a supermajority. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was balanced. As for David, he returned to the quiet routine he had always valued. Morning coffee on the porch, the quiet hum of sprinklers down the block, occasional waves from neighbors who now looked at him differently, not with pity but with respect. Some approached him privately, admitting they had once received questionable fines but felt too intimidated to object. Others confessed they had initially believed the HOA must have had a good reason. The foreclosure threat had made them realize how quickly enforcement could escalate beyond reason. David never positioned himself as a symbol. He hadn't set out to become an example. He simply wanted fairness. Yet his refusal to quietly comply created something larger. Local community forums picked up the story. A regional housing advocacy group cited the case when discussing reasonable accommodation rights in association-governed neighborhoods. Without ever stepping into a courtroom, David's situation became a quiet reminder that HOA authority is not absolute. The board itself changed tone. Official communications grew more measured. Enforcement letters shifted from immediate penalties to requests for correction. Where there had once been rigid deadlines and stacked fees, there were now structured conversations and documented review steps. They didn't admit fault, but behavior speaks louder than apologies. One afternoon, nearly a year after the first violation letter arrived, David stood at the edge of his driveway watching a new family unload boxes 2 houses down. The couple looked excited and overwhelmed. He walked over, introduced himself, and welcomed them to the neighborhood. He didn't tell them about the lien, he didn't describe the hearing. He simply offered advice. Read the bylaws carefully, attend meetings occasionally, and never assume a letter in the mail is the final word. Because that was the true lesson buried beneath months of stress. An HOA is a governing body, but it is still made up of people. People can overreach. People can misinterpret authority. And people, when challenged respectfully and persistently, can recalibrate. The ramp eventually blended almost invisibly into the driveway. Most passers-by never noticed it. But for those who knew the story, it represented something far larger than wood and concrete. It represented a boundary, a reminder that rules are meant to protect communities, not intimidate them. The emotional weight of those months lingered longer than the paperwork. There were nights when David had imagined packing his belongings into boxes. Moments when the idea of losing his home over something so minor felt surreal. The stress had tested his patience, his finances, and his faith in systems he once assumed were reasonable. But it also reaffirmed something he had carried since his military days. Stand your ground when it matters. Not with shouting, not with threats, with clarity, documentation, persistence. The neighborhood still looks polished from the outside. The entrance sign remains pristine, the landscaping uniform, the sidewalks clean. But beneath that surface polish lives a community more aware of its own governance. Residents understand their bylaws better. Board members think twice before escalating minor disputes. Accommodation requests are reviewed with documentation rather than dismissal. And perhaps most importantly, homeowners know they have a voice. What began as a $500 fine nearly became a foreclosure. Not because of missed mortgage payments, not because of neglect, but because enforcement outpaced empathy. The story could have ended very differently. A quick payment, a removed ramp, a quiet acceptance of authority. The neighborhood would have remained unaware of how close one of its own came to losing everything. Instead, the confrontation forced transparency. It forced conversation. It forced change. So the next time a homeowner receives a violation notice over something small, the question becomes bigger than the fine itself. Is this about maintaining standards or about maintaining control? Is this about preserving property values or preserving power? Because communities thrive not when rules are feared, but when they are fair. And sometimes, the most powerful act in a neighborhood governed by strict lines and tidy lawns is simply refusing to be quietly pushed aside. In the end, David didn't just keep his home. He reminded an entire community that authority works best when balanced by accountability. And that lesson will outlast any fine, any letter, or any board term ever could.